This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, this is Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 178 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. This is the third episode in the Reading is Fundamental series. As part of this effort, I'm going to be publishing 2 episodes per week, which is a little bit different than what I normally do. Normally, I just publish 1 episode a week on Wednesday. For this campaign, what is happening is that the B Podcast Network is partnering with Reading is Fundamental, which is a nonprofit that focuses on connecting educators and families with materials and training aligned with evidence-based literacy instruction. And they also offer unique book ownership solutions for professionals and families to address book equity issues. You can learn more about Reading is Fundamental in the show notes. I've linked to their website. One additional thing that I am doing specifically within my business and for my listeners is that within the month of September, so from September 15th through October 15th, I am offering my listeners 25% off when they join either the School of Clinical Leadership or Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. Language Therapy Advanced Foundations is my program that gives SLPs a framework for language therapy. You can learn more about that program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. And the School of Clinical Leadership is my program that gives related service providers a framework for supporting executive functioning so that they are able to work with their teams to get the right supports in place. You can learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. And to get that special 25% off between September 15th and October 15th, all you need to do is enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page. So now let's get to the episode. We are talking about using the term dyslexia in the schools, among other topics relating to advocacy and effective practice. In 2015, the Office of Special Education Programs published a letter stating that school teams were not prohibited from using the term dyslexia. Unfortunately, this letter left many questions unanswered and is often misinterpreted. Parents seeking out services for their children are still unsure how to advocate for appropriate services in their schools and communities. School teams are still unsure about what they're permitted versus required to do. Professionals are unsure who is qualified or responsible for identifying students with dyslexia and other learning disabilities. So that's why I invited Tom Parton to episode 178 of De Facto Leaders to discuss legal mandates, ethical obligations, and other factors school teams should consider when making decisions about curriculum and assistive technology. Tom Parton is a private speech-language pathologist in Normal, Illinois. He retired after 35 years of public school practice. Tom is the president of Everyone Reading Illinois and is a member of ERE's legislative committee. Tom has presented on autism and language and literacy topics at a local, state, and national level. Tom participated in the Illinois State Board of Education Reading Instruction Advisory Group and Teachers of Reading Certification Task Forces. He is currently a member of the Illinois State Board of Education Dyslexia Handbook Revision Team. He is past president of the Illinois Speech, Language, and Hearing Association and is an Illinois Speech, Language, and Hearing Association Honors Committee co-chair and a member of the Illinois Speech, Language, and Hearing Association's Leadership Development Committee. Tom is the 2024 chair of the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association Committee of Ambassadors. In this conversation, we discuss what do federal guidelines require when it comes to identifying and serving students with reading and writing disabilities, picking the right battles to fight. Do we focus on the labels or the services and curriculum, or a little bit of both? Who is responsible and qualified to diagnose dyslexia in the schools or in private practice? The ethical problem with giving up on word decoding in secondary school. And we talk about the skills that students need to effectively use assistive technology for reading, writing, and spelling. And we have a lot of great conversation about some of the impacts that word decoding can have, not just in school, but in vocational settings and life beyond school. Make sure that you check out the show notes because we link to a number of fantastic resources, including the Dyslexia Handbook from the Illinois State Board of Education, the Illinois State Board of Education Comprehensive Literacy Plan, the International Dyslexia Association, the Reading League of Illinois, and some links regarding the state dyslexia laws, as well as the letters from the Office of Special Ed and Rehab Services, letters on the use of the terms dyslexia and developmental language disorder. Now, please enjoy this interview with Tom Parton. Today, I am joined by Tom Parton, a speech pathologist from Illinois. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thanks. Appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, so I thought we would start off by having you share a little bit about yourself. Tell us your background and then what you're doing now.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a retired speech language pathologist from public schools. I still do private work. I did some pediatric clinic work after retirement. I started and worked in a small K-12 district, early childhood, but I also had a couple of senior high students. And then I was hired by a large district in which I was assigned the high school and two elementary schools. So I'd always been very interested in language and literacy and that reading connection. Did a little bit of that in grad school. But I really started to note those connections in working with the broader age group and supporting them. So I went on a journey. I joined the International Dyslexia Association. I've been very lucky to attend some of their conferences and see some real leaders in the field early on. And then I was working with a student who I was providing support in his high school health class, and then made the realization he couldn't even decode fever.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, I was like, I could be the best speech language pathologist in the world and support him in his curriculum, but he's going to walk out of here and not be able to read, a prescription bottle or other things that he will need in life. So I really dove in at that point and started doing my work with them and linking to decoding. I was lucky enough that the district supported. We had 4 classes for reading at the high school level. And I was also teaching a communication class. So that was back in the day when communication classes were a little bit more prevalent. So I was a teacher of those high school classes. And so I got to teach all 4 of those levels. I really looked at and learned a lot about students and profiles. And then I had some students come through, very bright, but the program that we had was not sufficient. They were pretty impacted, very bright, but very impacted in their decoding. And so the district again supported me teaching a class of Wilson and providing Wilson instruction. So I did that 3 years prior to my retirement. I've been involved with the International Dyslexia Association, the Illinois branch of the IDA, which eventually turned into Everyone Reading. I've been a board member with them. I'm current president of Everyone Reading Illinois. And through my work and focus, the ISHA, Illinois Speech Language and Hearing Association, I was appointed to the Reading Instruction Advisory Group when the dyslexia definition was first included in Illinois School Code, and am currently a member of the Dyslexia Handbook revision group. So I've not gone too far from that area, but I've learned a lot from every student I worked with.
Yeah, so many different things I want to ask you based on all of that, but I would love to, you mentioned at the end that dyslexia is now included in the Illinois School Code. So can you talk briefly about when we look at what it says as far as federal guidelines versus our state specifically? Because I know there's a lot of confusion about what terms teachers and therapists can use in the schools and what the legal mandates say, what we have to put on our paperwork, what we're required to do. So can you walk through, I guess, maybe start with federal and then talk about what is happening specifically in Illinois and what does that mean for practice? I think that's really the question that people want to know is here's what the mandate says, but what does that mean we're supposed to be doing?
I have a short answer and a long answer.
Yeah, let's do the short answer, and then I have some other questions, and we'll come back to it. Yeah.
Yeah, the language for Illinois came out of Decoding Dyslexia Illinois and a legislation they were trying to get specific to dyslexia. The federal mandate, of course, is child find in terms of in relation to our delivery of services as speech pathologists. So there's the aspect of child find, and so that's the legal mandate.
Basically, just saying we're required to identify students in need of services and provide appropriate services.
Correct.
Appropriate services.
Appropriate services, and
Yes.
that's really the key. So the definition has been around for 100 plus years. Dyslexia was included in the conversation during the drafting and the implementation of the original IDEA law in the early 70s. It's included in paperwork on IEP forms. So that word has been around a long time, but there continues to be a lot of misunderstanding around it. The Office of Special Ed in 2015 from the Department of Education said that it's okay to use the term dyslexia. There's nothing that precludes or stops anyone from using that term. The short answer is we as speech language pathologists work and understand and use diagnostic terms to help guide our intervention, be it a developmental sound disorder versus apraxia versus an expressive language disorder, autism. Teresa Hogan is doing dynamite work right now with developmental language disorder. All of that falls under a specific, a speech and language impairment in terms of the definition for a category for receiving an IEP. But we understand that overarching term, a speech language impairment, does not guide our intervention for stuttering, voice, language, articulation. And so the term dyslexia, being understood as the definition in basic deficit in decoding or basic reading skills, but that profile guides instruction, guides the understanding of the profile, and provides for specific interventions that student needs. So in terms of child find, if you say they have a reading disorder, well, what is causative or at the root of the difficulty that the student may have? Too often, districts are not They may have some of the assessment for decoding, and some districts don't. Uh,
Hmm.
so if we don't understand the deficit, we're not able to appropriately remediate. So there's nothing that says we shouldn't use dyslexia. And I still see and hear confusion and misunderstanding, but it's clarity of diagnostic, it's clarity of intervention, and clarity of goals.
So really, because my understanding was we're not prohibited from using it, which is actually what a lot of people thought. They thought it's medical, we can't use it, we have to use specific learning disability. But when it says it's we're not prohibited, it I could see a situation where maybe you've identified that a student on their eligibility category, it could say SLD, and maybe they've identified that it's dyslexia, but it's just they haven't used that term, but they're providing appropriate services. In that scenario, in theory, based on child find, they could be in compliance if they're showing that the student is making progress. But I could see how it would be useful for them to also say, and this student is diagnosed with dyslexia, just from a practical standpoint. But I think that's where it gets confusing, is because sometimes I hear people saying, oh, well, we're required to identify students with dyslexia. And that's not exactly what it says. It just says that we have to have the services be appropriate. And I think that's where the confusion lies.
Yeah, and we can get lost in that.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh-huh.
in in all my years, I mean, the bottom line is that they get the right, um,
Right.
appropriate intervention, and too often, especially here in Illinois, too often we're not doing the appropriate intervention for basic reading or decoding or a
Hmm.
speech pathologist in terms of some of those foundational skills.
Yeah.
Just another side note to the diagnosis: naming pain or naming
Hmm.
what's going on with me is so important for the
Yeah.
student. These
Hmm.
students, especially as I work with high school students, one of the first things that they deduce is that they're stupid. Everybody else is getting this code, they're not. And some of them are aware of that in preschool. Certainly in K through 2, they're
Hmm.
very aware of their differences. And then that continues to name and to let them know it's dyslexia. Here's the difficulty with your learning the code, learning decoding, impacting on your reading skills is it's very important for that
Hmm.
conversation with the student. And I think we should do that with no matter what the diagnoses or our
Yeah.
intervention is, that the student understands themselves. But
Yeah.
understanding that there's a reason and it's not them and it's not their intelligence is very powerful to the student.
Yeah, I agree. I can think of a scenario that where again where it's the school can technically figure out a plan that's appropriate with a more general category, but it's so much more helpful to doing that successfully if you have a specific diagnosis. I can think of a student who went to different practitioners outside the school. One said it's sensory processing disorder, one said it's autism, one said it's ADHD. And so what ended up happening, it's like, I guess it's other health impaired and we're going to figure it out. But if we would have had a more definitive diagnosis, we could have documented that and still maybe said other health impaired, or maybe we could have gone autism. It would have been helpful for the school team to have a little bit of a roadmap. And so I can see how if even if you're going to on the paperwork say SLD, specific language disorder, or specific learning disability, or SLI, but the student has a diagnosis of developmental language disorder, you can document that on the paperwork, know that you're not doing anything wrong by saying the specific terms in your narrative, and do a better job providing appropriate services the more specific you get.
Exactly. To your point, a lot of students with ASD have sensory processing and
Yeah.
ADD type of profile. Understanding where some of those other areas or other behaviors are manifest is so important because
Hmm.
if you know, the better and closer your diagnosis, your assessments, and the areas that you're looking at, the more effective your practice will be in your work.
Yeah. Okay, so one more question before I want to go on to the reading to learn versus learning to read and talk a little bit about the Wilson program and what you were able to do at the high school. But this is another one that comes up a lot with some of the parents that might be listening who are looking for services for their kids, or even therapists who are trying to figure out their role and their scope of practice. But the question of who can actually diagnose dyslexia. Like there's, do we have the skills and are we qualified versus legally what we're able to do in the school or in private practice?
Um, 2001, ASHA released a position
Mhm.
statement that we, as SLPs,
Yeah.
um, you know, our scope and practice includes reading and writing. Dr. Hogan, um, has said clearly in her presentations that speech language pathologists can diagnose dyslexia. Um, Not that we should be the only practitioner working on it,
Right.
understanding it, that.
Yeah, because clinical
But
psychologist, that's usually, or educational psychologist is usually what I think people often go to. But yeah.
but school teams,
Yeah.
just side note, school teams um, are sometimes the first identifier of a student with
Hmm.
autism.
Hmm.
Um, so um, we can do that. Now, in terms of best practice, yes, having a school psychologist, having an outside psychologist provide that diagnosis will open doors quicker and more effectively as they get older in terms of accommodations, in terms of accommodations for ACT, PSAT,
Hmm.
college accommodations. So if we as SLPs provide that diagnosis, it's still important to follow up with a school team or an outside evaluator, I think, to get that SLD diagnosis in order to provide more effective accommodations in the future.
Yeah, that's important. And I always felt like that as well, even if I was pretty sure that a student had a particular diagnosis, I liked the confirmation on paper because of exactly what you said, that especially in the schools, if a student is identified as speech and language impaired, then people think speech only. They get 30 minutes a week of something. They don't get the full IEP. And now I was in a district where sometimes, and we were careful about this because we didn't want to just start putting services on an IEP without the full assessment. But there were times when students got more than just 30 minutes a week of pull out speech therapy services because we looked and saw their language issues are impacting them academically. But I had some students where I'm in central Illinois. The student went up to, it's another area in the state, and they said, you can't do this on a speech IEP. Like so they questioned the IEP. And so it was looked upon differently. And again, that's why I did do that sparingly, even though I thought that we could have made a case for it, just because I know that legally it's going to get questioned based on the way things work.
Yes, and perceptions, and I ran up and was dealing with that issue pretty early on in having a communication class. So we're running 250 minutes per student because I'm seeing that student 50 minutes a day. Or, yeah, I'm seeing that student as a teacher 50 minutes a day, which looks like if they move to another district, oh my goodness.
Hmm.
So, yeah, at that point, who the provider is really the issue. But yes, transferring an IEP, the clearer you are, and again, another rationale, another reason to have dyslexia on there.
Yeah.
The clearer you are in your diagnosis, your assessments, your treatment, and what evidence your treatment has been prior to them moving. That's the power of communicating the needs.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. What does it mean when you say that dyslexia is in the Illinois school code? Is that just similar to the federal mandate that we're able to use the term? Or is there something more specific about training requirements?
Um, training requirements is another
Yeah.
issue.
Because don't some states, I know there's at least one state that says, school teams need this much training in dyslexia. I know there's a website somewhere where these are all the legal mandates in different states because every state is a little bit different, but
Yeah, one of the keys, because these students are so often misunderstood, not identified, or have inappropriate goals and focus, it's very important, and a lot of this work has come from parent groups or dyslexic groups. These kids need to be seen. Their struggles need to be recognized, identified, and
Mhm.
dealt with. And too often in many popular reading approaches, decoding is not seen as a viable way to teach kids. The teaching of decoding is not a viable way
Mhm.
to teach them. So these kids need to be seen, and that's where a lot of this legislations come from.
Mhm.
There are a number of states that have done a wonderful job, Ohio, Mississippi,
Mm.
with identification, and with identification and goes teacher training, as well as structured and support for these students. When everyone reading Illinois we worked for probably 7 to 10 years trying to get early literacy screening done. If you identify it as dyslexia, then what tends to happen is Gen Ed sees it as a special ed issue,
Mhm.
where it's theirs to worry about or deal with. So we backed off of the use of the term dyslexia because it separates people. People
That's
tend to get in
interesting.
their camps. When the point is, what are foundational skills? How do we assess those and understand how the curriculum is working or not working for them and what they need? So a lot of the states that have dyslexia legislation have come from these kids not being seen and not being identified for various reasons, and so they were able to successfully pass. Illinois, the definition of dyslexia, that was the result of the legislation that came through, I think it was 2014 or 2015 in Illinois. When I was part of that original group, we did get that definition included in the special education section of the Illinois School Code. But then our group also got the definition included in general ed. In other words, these kids, which when I talk about, or when we talk about dyslexia, and some people dismiss it because 15 to 20% of the population, it's a spectrum. I've worked with legislators who have said they have dyslexia. They're very successful people with dyslexia. So, and there's some very impacted, both in terms of their poor decoding, but are on a continuum of language and cognitive skills. So it's complex, but the point is these kids are out there and they need to be seen, and their deficits need to be seen for how they perform and the services in which they receive.
I'm going to take a quick break here to talk about the School of Clinical Leadership and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. As you're listening to the conversation, you're probably starting to realize how important it is for professionals to work on building their own skill sets for how they work directly with students, as well as understanding how systems work and putting strategic plans in place for working with the whole team. Because you can make a big impact with direct intervention, but you can make an even bigger impact if you take it a step further and also think about leadership and advocacy. So I help you do both things in the School of Clinical Leadership and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. In Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, I help SLPs and other professionals working on language create a system for language therapy so they can walk into sessions confident that they're giving kids the skills that they need to succeed and that they're building those foundational language skills that support high-level comprehension and literacy. To learn more about that program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. Now, many of my Language Therapy Advanced Foundation students, once they start to get confident in their protocol, realize that they need to be collaborating with their teams. So that's really the next step. And many of them realize that they should be working on executive functioning as well. Now, there's plenty of executive functioning work embedded into Language Therapy Advanced Foundations because work on metacognition is so important to effective language intervention. But we also have to think about what the entire team is doing because students need support when they leave your room. And part of that is ensuring the right scaffolding is in place across the environments that students are in. And when we think about executive functioning, we have to think about more than just literacy and academics. We also have to think about how students self-regulate, how they interact socially, and how they handle those unstructured situations during their school day, as well as outside of their school day. And you need a framework for navigating all of that because now, once we move beyond thinking about direct intervention, we're thinking about multiple service delivery models. And you need a framework for making that happen. I help you do that in the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. You can learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. As part of the Reading is Fundamental series, you can get 25% off either program, or actually both programs if you wanted to join both, between September 15th and October 15th. Just enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page when you're signing up to get this special rate. So really, it was just the specific definition of what it is was put into the code as
Correct.
something that educators need to be aware of. That's really interesting how I know that the whole point when people are pushing for the legislation, it's because we want those students to be better served. And so that's interesting that there's unintended consequences of sometimes it not working that way. And that you have to, as we were discussing in our previous conversation, figure out what do I really want to happen and what hill do I want to die on? Because sometimes the thing that you think is going to do it, for example, requiring people to use specific terms or a specific term being specifically identified, which obviously for diagnostic reasons can be very helpful, as we've discussed. But just when we're thinking about school reform, that again, it's you can't fix a tier 1 problem with a tier 3 intervention kind of a thing. We have to think about what's going on in the curriculum. And I think about that with other areas as well. So there's reading, there's the executive functioning. Do we focus on the interventions? Do we focus on tier 1? And I honestly, you probably should be focusing in both areas. But I'd love to go back to the topic of, okay, so we have students who are in secondary school. And I don't know if you experience this, but there's this pressure of, well, we're working on comprehension now. We're done working on decoding. And, the whole point of reading is comprehension. So why aren't we working on that? But then if you have a student who is in high school and they can't read the word fever and they've got this complex text that they can't necessarily decode all the words or write the words in their assignments or all those things, how is that going to impact their ability to access their curriculum, to benefit from different assistive technology that might be made available to them? So, yeah, let's discuss that.
That'll
That's
take the rest of the time.
about 20 questions there. But yeah, I do want to, I think I want to address the curriculum and we can talk about what Wilson is, but then also the use of technology, because
Sure.
that's something that comes up too with accommodations.
And as Dr. Snow had mentioned on one of your previous podcasts and called these kids instructional casualties, Dr.
Yeah.
Jane Fell Green, probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, labeled these students curriculum casualties. And I think that's a perfect term and a descriptor. So what happens is for those that it tends to be kindergarten through second grade that the teaching of reading goes on.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of people, educators, professionals that believe once that window is passed, it has passed. Those students will not learn to read. And we need to keep them in the curriculum. And that's what often happens as we look at student placement and supports for classes, et cetera, as they go through, especially in high school. I guess there's a lot more of that, but it does start to happen. I was involved with a couple of very bright students who got put in a special ed class because their decoding was so bad, and it was so bad.
Yeah.
They had no reason to be in an instructional special ed classroom. They were non-decoders and therefore couldn't write. Their spelling continues. They're young men
Yeah.
now. Their spelling continues to be abysmal. And what I would tell those students as I worked with them, there are different reading scores. It can't be, we do a disservice when we say they're at a blank level. Say whatever level you will, and we can discuss all those different ways of doing that. But there is comprehension and there's listening comprehension. So if they have access to the accommodations, yes, they can be at a college level comprehender. And I have worked with and identified that level of kid with dyslexia. But you give them text to read. You give them words non-contextually, so a list of words.
Mm-hmm.
And these students that I worked with from 6th grade through 12th grade, it's a good illustration. Receiving support in middle school did not really move their decoding skills in terms of word reading, non-contextualized word reading. I got them to a 6th grade level, but that was 4 years of work, and they were in. They took 3 years of classes with me in terms of the work of decoding and the Wilson and the other program.
Mm-hmm.
So that's 3 years of every day, and they took that as an elective. But they also had full access to the curriculum, which they should have had.
Mm-hmm.
So it's where those decisions come into play. When I first started putting together the reading program at the high school, I was looking and I reported to the administration every year the growth of these students because A, I wanted to protect that program,
Yeah.
and B, and it was so empowering to the students to get that feedback. But I wanted to prove these kids can still learn. And these kids, at ninth grade, 10th grade, I had one student enroll as a 12th grader. He was heading into college. He had to put up with some freshmen who were not happy to be in the class. And so I really felt sorry for the student. But in some of his assessment, standard assessment, he went up 2 standard deviations. So he was much more aware. He was a much better user of that assistive technology because as an independent reader, he was more effective and more efficient. So all of that work in college is going to be so much easier than if he had never received that instruction or the ability to develop his decoding skills. So there are different levels as we look at the different areas of the skills of reading. So the decisions need to be made how do we continue to develop those foundational or deficit skills? And how do we continue to give them access to the curriculum so they can continue to be learners and can continue that? But it's often hard for individuals and systems to understand that dichotomy and to give time and resources that these students need to develop those skills.
Mm-hmm.
But to not do that, I think, and I'll probably, because I've worked with students, I'll probably sound over the top here, but it's unethical, it's malpractice to not work on those deficit skills when we know they can be improved, and to shove that aspect under the rug is not serving these students well. But they also need that access to all of that technology for their curriculum work.
Mm-hmm. What was when you say that your student was a better user of technology and accommodations,
Mhm.
what what type of technology was he using? And what did the decoding do for him? Like, how did that help to make him a better user of that tool?
A perfect example would be one that often tends to be given first, and that's word prediction software
Mm-hmm.
for writing.
Yeah.
Okay, so and I'm using this as an example. They used a variety of, and we were blessed in the district that I was at. We had a wonderful assistive tech, and they worked with the students, and we handed that off as much as we could so that the student learned what worked best for them. But in word prediction software, you begin to type a word, and it's such as what's on our phones now.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not in the ballpark, if you're trying to write the word physical, for example, and you put an F, well, it's not going to give you the physical
Mm-hmm.
PHY that you're looking for. So you have to be in the ballpark. And for a very impacted student with dyslexia or decoding difficulties, they may not even be in the ballpark.
Yep.
But then what they're given are 4 or 5 words. Those 4 or 5 words are visually similar, phonetically similar oftentimes. It is a nightmare as a dyslexic student if you give them word prediction software and then expect them to use that. That could be one of the worst decisions. It's meant well intentioned, but it creates so much difficulty and anxiety and errors that it's not effective. I would use word prediction software later in my treatment or later in my therapy when we would decode the 4 or 5 words that were given, because that's a challenge
Mm-hmm.
because they do look so similar. But without those skills, then it's more difficult to manipulate the controls of assistive tech. Assistive tech on a website can be a nightmare with drop-down menus.
Mm-hmm.
Assistive tech with audio books, they may have different page numbers, and let's say in high school they want you need to search for quotes that a character gave and what page. Well, audiobooks, sometimes the page numbers are different than the page numbers that every other student in the class has. So
Mm-hmm.
there are barriers to the use of assistive technology or needs that they're going to have to get through. The better they are, the more efficient they are at decoding for control, for revision, for review. I have not dug deep in the research, but if you're at a third grade level of decoding words and you're at a ninth grade level of decoding words, all of those options and all of that text on the in assistive technology is going to be more effective because you are able to gain more for the reading that you do have to do
Mm-hmm.
using
Yeah.
other tools.
I always wonder too. So, and this is the audiobooks, this topic is an interesting conversation, which I've gotten into in a couple other interviews where obviously audiobooks are there's they're extremely helpful, especially for those students who need access to the language, the syntax, the vocabulary, and even just for engagement reasons that it's frustrating if you're always reading at a level that doesn't allow you to read books that are interesting to you. So that I know there's a lot of good reasons to incorporate audiobooks. And I was discussing within another interview that they're not a replacement, but they're something that's in addition to the work with print. But the other thing that comes up is that if you're using an audiobook, or I know some people like to listen and read along, what if you have what if you also have issues with language and working memory? And if you're only listening to an audiobook, I personally have a hard time if I don't have the written symbols there. For me, the written symbols are a form of, I guess, maybe a form of technology. So it's visual for me. So I have a hard time processing if I'm just listening. So I always wonder, do we want to put students in a situation where they only have access to one mode? And yes, we want to give them flexible options as far as the mode, but yeah, I wonder how the decoding would impact the student's ability to make use of audiobooks as well.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a visual support. And in all of this work as a speech language pathologist, what drew me to print and the use of print and curriculum is that it's static. It's there. It can be manipulated. It could be
Yeah.
understood.
Hmm.
Um, when we do certain tasks or some of the supports for test taking, for learning, for memory, for those of us that have the code accessible, we use that. So name 20 animals as fast as you can in 30 seconds. Some people will run the alphabet to
Yeah.
help understand.
I see the words in my head in
Right.
addition to the images. Like when I'm doing, self-talk and imagery, I do words and pictures.
These kids don't have that. They don't have that readily available, or if they
Yeah.
do, it's on sand. It's not secure.
Yeah.
So the aspect of audiobooks and reading along, again, every student, you've got to look to their profile, where they're at, and what works for them and not, and the task at hand. What are they reading for? The students that I was talking about that I consulted with through junior high and then worked with in high school, they had very intelligent young men. They had probably the best vocabulary of even regular high school students.
Yeah.
They had a love of history. One of them had a love of history and listened to audiobooks or was read to and had wonderful vocabulary. So there's that aspect of it opened up because that was his area of interest, that he was able to learn and enjoy and take in information via audiobooks. Curricularly, it depends on the task. What class are they in?
Hmm.
Are they taking notes? Are they having notes provided? Web searches prevent a number of obstacles. Research is really difficult for some of these students because if you think about, you type a term in that you want to research on a Google search or whatever, we scan. We
Hmm.
scan the page. We scan and go, oh, that's an ad. Oh, that's about a movie that had that topic. We know suddenly that we don't even need to
Or
click.
what about even menus? I mean,
Oh yeah.
they're
Oh yeah.
decontextualized, and yes, you can kind of if you've seen a number of different menus. I'm just thinking I have my Google inbox over here where I don't have context
Right.
clues. If I had never seen this menu before, I wouldn't know what this list meant.
And
And
that's yes, curricular menu, food menu. Oh yeah, these kids. There are many things that they have to overcome.
mhm,
Yeah.
yeah. And I don't know if you've ever played around with some of those screen readers that you can get on different web browsers. It's so I get so confused because I'm like, wait, where are the what is it reading right now? And it just reads it
Yes.
out of context and you're trying to scan and follow along and you got
Yeah.
to be quick.
And that's why we can't just say, oh, they have accommodations. They're going to be
Hmm.
okay. The use of that assistive technology, and we all use things to help us through the day, help us in work, but we figure out what works for us and we
Hmm.
figure out what doesn't. And these kids need instruction, support, reflection on that. I had one of the kids that I consulted with. He called me in May, and he was feeling guilty. He's looking at getting a new job, and with a new job are forms and
Oh
applications,
yeah. Hmm.
and he's feeling really bummed that he needs to reach out to his dad. And should I need this level of support? And I told him, you don't need that level of support every day. You don't need it every month. But here is a point where you're being inundated with forms. You're going to need that support. One of our board members and everyone reading, when they went to get their COVID vaccine, you have a page to fill out. Her son was in college at the time, very dyslexic, very bright, had all the supports. He just handed the thing to her and was like, we're in a line. I will not be able to complete this prior to getting up there. So it's access to life, but it's also access to healthcare, access to jobs.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, it takes time and it takes exploration and support to explore different what works for them and their needs.
Hmm. Well, and I think in it takes awareness to be able to say, "Hey, I need some help and I have someone right here who can help me out with this," to just be able to advocate and know how to do that in a way that isn't and I guess enabling or preventing you from being successful in other situations, to know how to
And,
do it
and
selectively.
exactly. And here he was feeling guilty for something that was more than appropriate. And when we
Yeah.
talk about advocacy, and this goes for any disability or any level, it is not easy to tell someone outside of your family, and sometimes even within your family, I am not good at.
Hmm.
That's something that we just don't do, or we're uncomfortable
Well,
doing.
and it takes a level of confidence that is very hard to build up if you've not had a good experience in school.
And yes, and
Mm-hmm.
understanding and practice and
Mm-hmm.
support. And that was another thing with the high school. You have dyslexia. Here are your needs. And so when you approach an instructor, how are we going to problem solve me being able to get through this task? And so I often would prep them and then say, I could be part of that conversation, but I'd like you to start that conversation. Because of that practice of advocacy and that ability to problem solve moving forward. And just one other little quick thing with those with dyslexia, it tends to run in families. So when I provide that level of understanding and diagnosis, I had one very bright student who got a master's degree. She may have gotten her doctorate. I lost track of her after her master's degree. But her dad's sitting there realizing he has dyslexia. He's college educated. And then I had another student very impacted, not in special ed classes, that once I taught him some basic decoding, would read the mail for his mom, and I ran into him later after he had kids and was aware of dyslexia runs in families, and I have to be aware for my kids.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it's a nasty label that people don't like to talk about, but it's so empowering when you understand it. And that goes for, how you got to where you are and the ability to positively let family members know or even offspring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm just thinking of so many situations in an employment situation to be able to ask for what you need and be successful in your job so that you can put all those supports in place for yourself or ask because there are things that you can ask for when you're filling out a job application and different accommodations for interviews, because I'm just thinking of the interview process that I just went through for a government position. There is a, you know how normally you have a two-page resume? Well, my government resume is 7 pages long. There's a lot of writing. And then in the application, you have to fill out a detailed narrative. And then when you go and interview, they put all the interview questions on the screen, and then it's like an oral exam. You know, it's not conversational. It's you have this much time and you have to fill out. And you know, when you do a job interview, you've got to structure your narrative and do your situation action result. And there's a lot of language processing, reading, looking at multiple modes at the same time. And you can ask for accommodations for those, but it's, as you said, you're inundated with a lot at once. And then of course there's whatever job you decide to take, that where there are situations like that as well, where you need to know what your tools are and how to use them. So
And I would always tell the kids, life is a lot more adaptable than school. I mean, you have to take science, you have to take, that type of thing. We tend to, if we're lucky enough to work in a job in which we have some level of success and enjoy. But the big question for accommodations moving out of high school is, how do I have that conversation, the initial conversation, and when do I identify?
yeah, yeah, that
And
is.
one of the Kareem Weaver out of Fulcrum, and he's been very involved in reading advocacy. And he talked about the fear, if you're a poor reader and you have a job, the fear is that you're going to be discovered and that you may
Mhm.
lose that job. And if you may
Yeah.
lose that job, you lose your ability to provide.
Hmm.
So there's constant fear of being found out. So talk about imposter syndrome. These
Yeah.
individuals who struggle with reading, especially if they don't have an understanding of their disability or difficulties. Um, the trauma that is always there, the fear and anxiety that's always there, and to not identify and not work with and educate these individuals, we continue that anxiety and we continue that trauma, if you will, in their
Hmm.
life. So
Yeah.
that's another real reason to see these kids, to understand
Hmm.
that they exist.
Yeah. Well, so I know that you are involved in a lot of different projects and political, just different advocacy efforts. So, where can people go to connect with you and learn a little bit more about some of the initiatives that you're involved in?
I would say for anyone, so I'll answer that in two ways. So remind me if I forget the second one.
Okay.
As a clinician, you can't wait for somebody else in your district to provide that foundation. Do the assessments, understand how the speech and language profile impacts on literacy. Do those assessments, learn as much as you can, and then watch and let those assessments guide you in terms of what works well and what doesn't. So that you can't wait for somebody else. I've seen generations of kids lost. There are a number of groups in which you can be involved, and that involvement helps with advocacy. That involvement helps with a community, and I found that very important. That I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't the
Yeah.
lone soul that
Yeah.
was worried about this. That there are other people that have been on this journey, and they may be psychologists or social workers or interventionists or teachers, and parents are great. So there are organizations. I'm involved with Everyone Reading Illinois, and the president of that association. We do a lot of simulations and education throughout the state. We have worked legislatively. We did get a seat on the Illinois Comprehensive Literacy Plan, so that's a resource. the dyslexia handbook, the ISB dyslexia handbook, is a lot better and has a lot more information, still going under revision. There are a lot of resources there. I did a lot with the related service personnel when we revised that, with the point of understanding what are our roles and how do those impact reading and writing, and how do we link our terminology or our viewpoints on the impact of those. So that everyone reading Illinois, there's the Reading League, the SLD project in Illinois is going on. It's funded for about another year and a half. So some of these organizations, International Dyslexia Association, there are some local organizations. The Naperville dyslexia group just recently disbanded, but it was a wonderful, very strong group. So look for those in your area. The Reading League has a wide variety of people involved, and they will have legislative actions and advocacy and education, and that's key. When we still go out and do simulations throughout the state, people don't know there's an Illinois Comprehensive Literacy Plan. They've never heard of the Dyslexia Handbook. I was on the ISB group 10 years ago. We testified to a special ed subgroup at ISB, and I said I was sitting here 10 years ago, and there are people that don't know this information exists.
Yeah.
So use that, look at that. ISB's been a lot more supportive in literacy and recognizing, our scores are nothing to brag about. Those with an IEP are disgustingly low. We have some subgroups that are terrible. So any organization, of course, I love everyone reading Illinois, but your professional organizations as well, ISHA, psychologists and social workers, we need more people aware of these issues and the research that's been out there for years. No matter and try not to get into a camp of it's got to be this way or it has to be that program. It has to, the structured literacy is probably the best lens to view it from. It needs to be explicit. It needs to be taught. Mm-hmm. We don't learn to read naturally, and if we're not really teaching decoding, then we're not really serving our students well. So please don't wait for others. There's a generation sitting in front of you, and they need your help.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all of the links that were mentioned in this episode and where you can go to connect with our amazing guest. In this episode, I mentioned the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. You can learn more about that program at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. And I also mentioned Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs create a system for language therapy. You can learn more about that program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. You can get 25% off either the School of Clinical Leadership or Language Therapy Advanced Foundations as part of the Reading is Fundamental series when you join either program, or actually you could join both programs if you want to, between September 15th and October 15th. All you need to do to get 25% off of either program or both programs is enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page when you sign up. Here's what you can do right now to support the Reading is Fundamental campaign and this special series that we're doing on De Facto Leaders. First, you can go to Apple or Spotify or any other directory you use for podcasts and subscribe to the De Facto Leaders podcast. Once you listen to an episode or two, leave me a rating and review because that helps get my show into the hands of people who need the information. Finally, if you have a colleague or friend who needs to learn more about the research surrounding language and literacy, or you want to spread the word about practices and ideas you'd like to see in your school, community, or state, then tell them about De Facto Leaders so they can listen to all of the episodes in this special series. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.